Echo of Death, a Tom and Scott mystery, fifth book in the series. By Mark Richard Zubro, publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York, narrator, Eric Ost. Acknowledgements. For their kind help and patience, Barb D'Amato, Hugh Holton, Rick Paul, and Kathy Pekaiser Reed. Chapter 3. Sweeping down the street from the north through the mist was Lester Smitherton, walking his two German shepherds. The dogs heeled one to each side, while Lester held the leashes in limp wrists. He wore a shocking pink jacket, almost brighter than the sun rising about us. He wore fluffy blue warm-up pants, applied with pink lightning bolts. He wore bright white tennis shoes with tiny pink dots on them. He loved to wear this or even more outrageous outfits. When he walked the dogs, he often expressed the desire for gay bashers to try and mug him while he was in the company of Oscar and Wilde. He'd had them specially trained to defend him. I'd met Lester 10 years ago in a used record shop up in Rogers Park. We'd been hunting through the folk music bin. I'd been there first and picked up a long out-of-print Bob Gibson album. His first words to me were, "I'll give you $50 for that album." We wound up having a long discussion about collecting folk music. I was really just an amateur, trying to find artists I liked. Lester was an eclectic connoisseur, concentrating not only on folk music, but on a wide variety of esoterica. One of his most prized finds was a 10-inch album by Blossom Derriere from the 1950s, made by WVBR in Ithaca, New York. He also collected popular music of the 40s and 50s, especially Joe Stafford, whom I also liked. His absolute favorites, which he insisted on showing everyone who entered his home, was something I thought made him wonderfully unique. He had a collection of original albums with teen tragedy songs on them from the late 50s and early 60s. He loved nothing better than a group wailing a pathetically schmaltzy simple melody of hopeless love. He never played any of the records, but once. That to record them on tape, and then he made a tape of the tape to store in a safe deposit box. We'd gone out for coffee that first day afterward. We'd kept up contact. Lester had invited us to a few parties, and over the years, the three of us had become good friends. Occasionally, he gave investment tips to Scott, who passed them on to his accountant. Several had paid big dividends. He lived in one of the few mansions still standing on Lakeshore Drive, north of Oak Street, just a block and a half from our place. His investments had been shrewd and immensely profitable. He was an investment banker in one of the big LaSalle Street firms and had been for 20 years. He'd also inherited a substantial pile when a favorite uncle died. As he approached, as the dogs began to wag their tails, Lester smiled and waved. When Lester stopped 3 feet from us, the dogs immediately sat down. "What's wrong?" Lester asked us. "I don't believe it," I said. "You both look exhausted. I'm about to make breakfast. You must come to my place and let me fix you something." Lester was also a master chef. Although I hadn't slept, I found that my nerves were still strung far too taut for me to fall asleep. I agreed. "That sounds good," Scott said. We walked the short distance to Lester's. First, he served us exquisite coffee in the living room. One dog sat on either side of Lester's chair. The living room was what one of his ex-lovers had called the trash room. Lester had the money to indulge his whimsical taste. All those little knickknacks you almost impulsively bought, but came to your senses in time. Lester had them in this room. In addition, he attended conventions where thrift shops could purchase mounds of useless merchandise. This room was a trash nightmare. Among other things, scattered along the shelves were a Dutch civil defense urinal, a music box that played a funeral march, round plugs of AstroTurf left over from the manufacture of putting greens, and a collection of parachute rings. This was not to mention the more mainstream debris of a 3D Viewmaster from the 1950s, a hubcap from a 1947 Studebaker, a Don King troll doll, and a glass case filled with his belt buckle collection. Lester was in his 50s with short grizzled hair, a deep cleft in his chin, and a slender, although unmuscular body. He settled himself in his favorite canary yellow overstuffed chair, drew his knees up to his chest, wrapped his arms around them, and said, "Tell me all." I explained everything to him. When I finished, I summed up. Somebody killed Glenn Proctor. We got chased, but not shot at as aggressively as we could have been. Someone broke in and took the body away from the penthouse. These people got by security twice. Lester said, "While I make breakfast, we must think of a plan." I discovered I was ravenous. The night before, at the fundraiser, we had dined on that peculiar form of dead chicken grown, I was sure, for just such banquets, the tasteless, dried-out bird that gives its life so you'll open your wallet and give your money. I generally didn't like being in Lester's kitchen. I hate to cook, and you could barely look anywhere in this kitchen without observing clues that a gourmet lurked nearby. On the top of a set of cabinets and hanging on a wall was a vast collection of all the modern cooks' gadgets, sold at all the trendier stores. The only ones I remotely recognized were the graduated wire whisks, whose function I would never understand. One simple fork did most of the mixing I needed. Dangling from the ceiling were enough copper pots to obscure half the ceiling. What was worse, Lester knew how to use every device in the kitchen and loved to entertain with lavish dinners for small, intimate groups of friends. Lester began yanking vegetables out of the refrigerator and placing them on the butcher block table in the center of the room. "I know a Jason Proctor," Lester said. "Filthy rich." "Same family," Scott said. "Remember the time I got you passes to the field before the game?" Lester nodded. Glenn Proctor was the one horsing around with the baseball bat. "The one rubbing it up the butt crack of the dark-haired outfielder?" Lester's eyes shone. "Him," Scott said. "Is he?" "No," Scott said. "A practical joke playing straight prick tease," I said. "He was very blonde and sexy like Scott," Lester said. "Was not," I said. Lester ignored us and asked, "Why are you in peril? You were not in jeopardy before Proctor came. You are now, therefore, and quite obviously you are in danger because of Proctor. What have you done?" "We let him stay at our place," Scott said. "Not something to kill somebody for," Lester said. "It's not as if we were protecting or hiding him," I said. "We didn't think it was some kind of secret." "Nor, evidently, was it a secret to whoever is bothering you," Lester said. "They killed him, leaving aside their reasons for doing him in. What makes it necessary to do you too?" "We know something," I said, "or Proctor brought something into the penthouse that they want." "Why not just take what they want and leave you alone?" Lester asked. "We'd be happy to give it to them if we knew what it was," Scott said. "Did either of you see the contents of his luggage?" Lester asked. I said, "I didn't see anything except him strutting around in his blue jeans, starched white shirt, and gym socks the first night, or yesterday prancing around in his underwear, and then a pair of the skimpiest gym shorts I've ever seen." While we talked, Lester's hands flew as he diced vegetables, whisked eggs, shook out spices, and sliced fresh bread. Scott said, "I helped him carry his stuff in. I didn't see anything unusual, though. When I got up early to go to the bathroom yesterday morning, I ran into him. We sat in the breakfast nook for about an hour, and I talked before Tom got up." "Why didn't you tell me this?" I demanded. "I don't report all my conversations to you," Scott said. "Did he tell you anything that might explain what's been going on?" The cold asperity in my voice matched the angry annoyance in his. Scott glared at me, then said, "He told me nothing I can think of connected to all this. Do you think I wouldn't have told you if he'd said something that could help us?" My good sense told me he would have, but the angry and frightened part of me wanted to throttle him for not telling me about their conversation. "Gentlemen," Lester said, "we need to stick to the questions at hand. One major concern is, did you see anything Proctor had that might have some value?" Scott shook his head. "He gave us presents," I said. I explained about the necklaces Proctor had given us. Scott unhooked the chain and handed it to Lester, who ran a critical eye over it. I have no idea whether these are real, he said, from what you say about him and his so-called deals that have turned out to be duds. I have my doubts. Although this is the most beautiful green, he shook his head and handed it back to Scott. Either he got taken or he wanted to impress you with a little glitter and glass. These could be the crown jewels of King Otho, the insignificant or a national treasure of Mexico smuggled out of the country. We've got to use logic and common sense, I said. Maybe it's really simple. You constantly see headlines about drugs flooding in from Mexico, South America, and the Caribbean. This could easily be some kind of drug deal gone bad. Proctor has that reputation. Maybe he found the opportunity. We never saw any drugs, Scott said. He certainly never mentioned it, but his suitcases were gone, so if he had any on him, whoever was after him took it with him. He wouldn't necessarily mention it to you if he was trying to use you in some way, Lester suggested. Use us how? I asked. Lester shrugged. I don't know. What I think is essential to figure out is if they got what they wanted. Why keep after you? Proctor said he came straight to our place from the airport, Scott said. We have no proof of that. Maybe he took the stuff and hid it someplace in the city. Could be whoever is after us thinks we know where it is. If they are still looking for something, then it would make sense to keep us alive, I said. If they found it without the information they think you have, why waste the time to come back and kill you? Lester asked. I don't know, I answered. Did they ransack your place? Lester asked. No, I said. Then maybe they weren't looking for something. Then why take the luggage? I asked. Was it gone the first time you came back? Lester asked. I don't know. We didn't have time to look in the bedroom, so they could have killed him for the luggage or come back for him and the luggage. That's what I don't get, Scott said. Why come back for him? They must have known we'd report to the police. Not if they made you dead first, Lester said. But they didn't stay and wait for us to come home to kill us, Scott said. Lester rubbed his hands together with all too much eagerness. What a wonderful series of puzzles, he said. I ignored my annoyance at his delight. We've got to sort this out or we could get killed, I said. They weren't looking for something, but they took the luggage. Proctor is dead. But they came back and then take the body to make it look like nothing happened. That defies logic. Not to the people who did it, Lester said. They didn't want a particular thing the second time, Scott said. They wanted us. We didn't get shot at until we were in the tunnels, maybe because they'd ordered us to be taken alive, but then why start shooting? It's crazy, Lester commented. We knew or know something, I said. Or they think you do, Lester added. A secret that Proctor was supposed to tell us, Scott said. But what did he tell us? Except for the conversation you had with him this morning. We were both around when he talked. I didn't hear him say anything that somebody might kill him for. He didn't say anything to me, Scott said. He mostly talked about baseball, or how proud he was to be free of drugs and alcohol, and how he was sure he'd make a contribution to his team next year. You're sure? I asked. Yes, Scott said. Silence permeated the room for several minutes while Lester set a magnificent repast before us. After slacking my appetite, I said, I'd like to talk to the Proctor family. They have a right to know what's happened to their son. Also, they've got to have some idea of what's going on. Lester said, I have some connection with Mr. Proctor from my work at the bank. We aren't best friends, but we play a round of golf once in a while. I had a hand in a few of his deals. I may be able to get you in to talk to him. You golf and you're gay? I said. You must be the only gay person on the planet who plays golf. I forced myself to learn, Lester said. My straight clients get so impressed if I can golf. What kind of guy is Mr. Proctor? Scott asked. Fiercely aggressive, Lester said. Hates to lose at golf or anything else. Big in real estate in this city. If he's not the biggest, he's pretty damn close to the top. Buys and sells huge or expensive or both pieces of property. Make enormous profits. Lots of battles over the years. Can't stand to lose. How can you deal with that kind of person? Scott asked. Business, Lester answered. You want to do deals in this town. You'll bump up against old man Proctor at some point. I'm surprised you'd be bothered by fierce competition. I've seen you pitch. It's a battle, and the most warlike wins. Not like that, Scott said. We're paid to entertain and supposedly win. The owners may be rapacious monsters, but for most players, it's a job. That's what this is for Proctor, his job, and he's very good at it. As we finished the meal, Lester promised to do what he could to get us in to see Jason Proctor. I prodded Lester to tell us more about the Proctor family finances. Wealth, wealth, and more wealth. Orrin Proctor, the grandfather of young Glenn, owned several railroads. He invested in Canadian municipal bonds and gold just before the stock market crash in 1929, so he was spared its horrors. He managed to hold on to and eventually increase his wealth. Jason Proctor, immediate sire of Glenn, could have lived a life of luxury simply on what Daddy had, but Jason had ambitions. He began to branch out and dabble in many fields. Always seemed to make a go of them. He invested in 2 movies, and they became blockbusters. Threw money into Texas oil in the early 80s, and then ran just before the crash came in the mid-80s. He's had a lot of luck. Where does most of his money come from now? I asked. Investments in just about anything, Lester said. A guy with that much wealth has his finger in a zillion pies. Shopping centers in Singapore, an office building in Zurich, an auto parts monopoly in Santiago, Chile, and hundreds of things in between. Is he a billionaire? I asked. Not quite that much, but enough so he could retire today and live for the rest of his life in luxury. Unknown to most of the inhabitants of the globe. Do you know anything about Glenn's mother? I asked. I have never met Mrs. Proctor. She is in real estate also. Rumored and real marital problems have plagued them, both for years. She is supposedly at least as rich as he in her own way. They'd break any law to get back at each other. When you're that rich, you can ignore most codes of conduct. You become a law unto yourself. I've dealt with them, but not her. If you'd like, I can try and get more information about both of them for you. I told him I'd appreciate it if he would. A few minutes later, we thanked Lester for breakfast and left. We trudged in silence back up the inner drive. I found I was exhausted. It was after 9 in the morning at this hour. On Saturday, the inner drive was crowded with shoppers, heading for breakfast, brunch, or the stores on North Michigan Avenue. On the inner drive, which passed immediately in front of our building, a line of honking cars crept around a stopped carriage. Chicago has those ubiquitous carriage rides that clomp people around the streets at a pace guaranteed to blow at least a few drivers' tempers, although the time Scott and I took one in San Francisco, it had been reasonably pleasant and romantic. This one was stopped because the driver was arguing with the passengers. They wanted to get out now. I couldn't help hearing the shouted arguments. As we neared our door, I began to wonder about our safety. If they'd attacked once, why not again? I didn't think we were in the clear yet. We'd have to find a place to take refuge. Across the way, the couple in the carriage were now arguing with each other in voices that could be heard at least a block away. Each was accusing the other of making a public spectacle. The gist of the whole thing seemed to be that the man wanted a full refund and the woman wanted to go home. So much for romance. The driver intermittently added an antiphon to their duet. Mostly he wanted his money. Finally the woman leaped from the carriage and began stalking away. Her date climbed down but seemed torn between following her and getting his money. He and the driver continued a discussion in a more modulated range. Scott pointed to the carriage and said, "The whole world has gone crazy." I wanted to lose my temper with those cops, I said. I was close a couple of times, but it's probably better we didn't. Quinn sort of sounded like he was willing to listen. I hated Belowski, I said. We were talking outside our building. Scott rubbed his arms. We hadn't worn our jackets, and it was cool. What happened to Glenn and why? I asked. How can we prove it? How can we get something the cops will believe? They'll track the team down in Mexico, Scott said. They can try to confirm whether he was there or not. But it won't prove he had 2 bullet holes in him or on our living room floor. It's a start. I turned toward the door. Two men in gray suits emerged from around a dark corner on the north side of the building. I grabbed Scott. "What?" he said. He turned to look. I swiveled my head around. Two more men, both with guns out, were approaching from the south end of the building. I twisted my head back. The first two now flashed some lethal-looking artillery. All four seemed to be in decent enough shape to give us a good chase if we tried to run, although they had us boxed fairly well right and left, and flight in those directions were cut off. In seconds, I was pulling Scott after me to the only alternative. We dashed toward Lakeshore Drive. I was willing to cause a multi-car pile-up if it would draw attention to our plight. First, we drove out onto the inner drive to the left. I saw a row of southbound cars rushing toward us. They had just been released from the stoplight of LaSalle Drive. We made it across ahead of them. Our pursuers were stuck behind this vehicular barrier. Two shots rang out as I eased around one of the cars, maneuvering slowly past the carriage. The passenger was just handing the driver some money. They both gaped at us. I crouched behind the carriage. Scott joined me as several more shots rang out. The passenger took off running. The driver looked from us to the guys attempting to dodge the traffic. Another shot rang out, striking the pavement inches from my left hand. The driver chose discretion and bolted the horse, whinnied, flicked its ears, and tried to pull the carriage with it. For the moment, the animal was being used to the noise and chaos of the city, and the brake being in place kept the horse from going berserk. I didn't want to leave the temporary safety of the carriage. I was still willing to try a dash across the drive, but their shooting added a dangerous dimension. I wondered why hadn't they shot at us immediately earlier, when it had been much less public. Scott said, "Follow me." He leaped into the carriage and grabbed the reins. I tumbled in after him. He ducked down as well as he could, released the brake, and flicked the whip at the old nag. The carriage lurched forward as more shots rang out. For a moment, we trotted down the road. I kept my head down. Scott knelt on the carriage floor with legs spraddled, urging the horse to greater swiftness. Balancing myself with both hands, I eased my head up so that my eyes peeked over the bunting around the back seat. A stream of cars followed us, the ones on the left passing with the occupants staring at us. Two guys waving their guns and running furiously chased us on foot. I saw a car start up on the side street next to our building. The car's tires screeched and the vehicle headed north into the temporarily vacant southbound lanes and came barreling after us. I looked forward. Another set of cars released from LaSalle Drive approached rapidly. We were about 200 yards from the corner ourselves when I glanced behind. One of the gunmen stopped running and aimed carefully. With the rapidly expanding distance and the violent shaking of the carriage, I doubted whether he could hit us. But I grabbed Scott and made him duck. I heard several shots, but didn't notice that anything hit us. When I looked again, one hood had resumed the chase and was falling further behind. The other was reloading. The poor old mare had long since passed from a trot to a dead run by this time. The carriage was careening nearly out of control. Brakes squealed behind us as our pursuers met the oncoming traffic. My head bobbed with the motion of the carriage as I watched the pursuing car face the onslaught. Horns blared as the driver wrenched the vehicle into the northbound lanes. I looked ahead. Scott now stood up with his legs spread wide, hips against the rim of the carriage, balancing himself against the wild swaying of our escape vehicle. With the reins gathered in one hand and the whip flicking out over the back of the horse in the other, he looked just like a Roman charioteer. I'd have loved to be in a chariot race if this is what it would have been like, but more practical considerations quickly overcame the thrill of a dash, reminiscence of ages past. "Get down!" I shouted. I swear to God, he actually yelled, "Yeah!" and then cracked the whip over the horse's back. His only response to my warning was to bend his knees slightly. He glanced back, flicked the reins, employed the whip, turned forward again, and gave another yell. We rushed on. I examined the activity at the intersection ahead. Cars streamed by on LaSalle Drive, moving to or from Lakeshore Drive. Traffic continued to flow heavily. LaSalle Drive was one of the major entrances to the drive for people who'd spent some time on the near north side of Chicago, enjoying the plethora of shops and restaurants available. As we neared the light, it changed to red in our direction. Scott swung out into the emptying southbound lanes and maneuvered into the intersection, the cars starting up from our left and right. Stopped abruptly, horns blared, but we raced across LaSalle. Once again, our pursuers jumped into the southbound lane, but they were too far behind, and after we passed the traffic flowed forward from both directions, our attackers ran up against a wall of moving protective autos. I heard the crunch of metal on metal. I looked back. They tried to force themselves through the traffic. I hoped they'd had a multi-vehicle traffic snarling accident. Scott didn't spend much time on LaSalle Drive. Within seconds, we were on the grassy area of Lincoln Park, moving rapidly north and west toward the zoo. I stood up facing backward and felt the racing wind on my back. I could see brake lights still jammed together at the intersection, but we were too far away for me to pick out the car that had been chasing us. I turned back to Scott. "This horse isn't going to be able to keep this up much longer," he said. "She's old, and I'm sure she hasn't gone this fast in a long time. We've got to find some place to hide and call the cops. They have to believe us now." "They'll believe the gunshots," Scott said. The horse had slowed to a trot. "Into the zoo?" "No, I don't know my way around. Lincoln Park Zoo was the most often visited zoo in the country, and one of the few that was still free. I hadn't been since my parents took me when I was 5. I barely remembered it. I didn't want to be driving a horse and carriage around aimlessly in an unfamiliar environment. We'll leave the horse and carriage in the park. If they find it, they'll have to guess whether we're in the zoo or back into the neighborhoods." Scott drove about half a block past the exit to Dixon Street. He tied the horse to a tree on the east side of the road. Ducking behind cars and keeping in the shadows, we raced back. Seeing no traffic on Dickens or Marine Drive, we ran west. At Clark Street, we stood in his shadow until all traffic had passed. Of course, we didn't see a cop car. We burst across the street and tore down the block toward Lincoln Avenue. A car turned from Hudson Street into Dixon and began to cruise slowly toward us. I shoved Scott into a shadowed doorway. We froze while the car passed. It turned out to be a Toyota Tercel with 2 women in the front seat. So far, I hadn't noted any of our nemesis being women. "Where the hell are we running to?" Scott asked. I drew deep breaths. "Call the cops?" "I don't see a phone booth. Can we afford to be in one spot for too long?" "No." I glanced both ways down the street. No cars were coming. "Maybe we can get a cab on Lincoln Avenue." We dashed west on Dickens to the corner for the moment. Lincoln Avenue was devoid of traffic. "We can't stay out in the open like this," Scott said. We ran west and at Oz Park cut across it toward the northwest. At the corner of Webster and Halstead, we stopped for a second. "Traffic coming from both ways," Scott said. Quickly, I looked for a place of refuge. A doorway loomed several feet away. "There," I said, and ran in. I opened the door. We stumbled down several stairs, but landed standing in the middle of a tile-covered lobby. Each of 3 walls had one couch with ripped dark red vinyl cushions. The 4th wall had a reception desk. No one stood at the desk, but I heard cheerful humming coming from somewhere further inside. I glanced out the windows that you had to look up to see out from the sunken lobby. I thought I saw a dark sedan like the one that had been chasing us. I slunk across the lobby and tried the door that I assumed led to the rooms. It was locked. I ran up to the counter of the reception desk and banged the little bell. It gave off a tiny ching. The humming stopped. A perfectly immense woman emerged from behind a 6-foot switchboard. She eyed us carefully. "You look like hell," she stated. She leaned her bulk against the counter from the other side. She could easily have wrapped us both in her fond embrace and had room for one more. Her gray hair was pulled straight back, but left to dangle in wisp of curls at her neck. The color of her eyes was lost behind thick glasses, through which she inspected both of us in turn. "I'm Edna," she said. "I own the hotel. You boys look like you need some help." I didn't want to make long explanations, nor take her into our confidence. "We need a room," I said. "Sure," she said. Fumbling with forms and keys took several minutes. I must have glanced anxiously at the doors and windows every few seconds. If Edna noticed, she made no comment. I gave her cash for the room. She gave us a key from a row of mailboxes behind her. Before we left, she winked at us and told us to have a good time. The key led us through the lobby doors. We walked down faded red carpeting, up a set of creaking wooden stairs, and down faded brown carpeting to a room at the end of the hall. The room had one regular-sized bed with a salmon-colored Chanel bedspread. The carpet was murky green. Two identical pictures of bubbling waterfalls were bolted to opposite walls. "What is this place?" Scott asked. I looked at the key. "Says the Luxor," I said. "Never heard of it." But I had. Scott hadn't grown up in Chicago, and I wouldn't be expected to know it, but I did. The Luxor had a reputation in the gay community as a place you could take a prostitute for an hour or two. Look up the word sleaze in the dictionary and you'd find a picture of the Luxor Hotel. Supposedly, there were sex orgies on the roof on hot summer nights, jockstrap parties on New Year's Eve, which could set up a call boy's reputation for years, a Monday afternoon lavish buffet for the transgender denizens of the hotel and their friends, a leather dungeon where home movies of S&M activity were shown continuously. We had seen absolutely no signs of this tawdry activity as we crossed the lobby. Rotten luck. I explained about the Luxor's reputation to Scott and finished, "No one would look for us here. We'll be safe for a while." Scott wandered into the bathroom and returned, instantly shaking his head. I decided not to ask what he'd seen. "We've got to call the cops," he said. "Our enemies could be listening on police scanners," figuring since we're good citizens, the logical thing to do would be to call the police. Even if they didn't get here first, all they'd have to do would be to wait until the cops left and move in. We need to be very careful. Maybe I can call Joe Quinn and explain what happened. They must have gotten calls from people about the traffic problems, and someone must have reported the gunshots. If I call them direct, we won't have to worry about their putting it on the police radio. "They're probably looking for us for stealing the guy's carriage," Scott said. "They aren't going to put us in jail for that." It took nearly 15 minutes of transferring around for me to get a hold of Joe Quinn. "Where are you?" he demanded. "If you really wanted to find out," I said, "you could check the phone records at 11th and State and pinpoint the origin of this call. Could you just listen for a minute?" "What the hell happened outside your building?" he asked. "We're scared," I said. "We aren't at home. I don't think that's safe right now. We don't want anyone to find out where we are." "Nobody's going to get the phone records to be able to trace the call, and if they could, only I know it's your calling from this number. The person who owns it would be on the screen or printout." As I hesitated, he said, "That's as much assurance as I can give." "Okay," I said, and gave him our location. Quinn added, "Nobody's going to follow me to where you are. We need to talk. Don't go anywhere." "We're the ones who called you, remember? We want to report this. We didn't do anything wrong." "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said. It took 45 minutes for Quinn and Balowski to show up. Quinn's attitude remained reserved, but I thought willing to listen. Balowski managed to keep his annoyed with a snarl under control. "Hell of a hidey place," Balowski said. I stifled my urge to tell him that if he'd feel better, we could move to the Ritz. I didn't want to antagonize him. We had to tell the story 3 times. They interrupted incessantly with questions. After we finished explaining, Quinn said, "We were late getting here because we checked the reports about what happened outside your apartment house this morning. The guy from the carriage rental agency was angry at his driver, the horse, and you." "I'll buy his goddamn horse and carriage if he wants," Scott said. "You may have to," Quinn said. "Also, the media got hold of the story. I don't know if you were recognized, but nobody is going to be able to keep the name of Scott Carpenter out of the papers if he's connected with a police matter." "We had to take the horse to escape," I said. "Not about the horse," Quinn said. "About the guns, shots, and car chase. We had 3 fender benders, mostly from people gawking at you guys racing down the street. According to witnesses, the guys chasing you didn't get out of traffic until you disappeared into Lincoln Park. Said it was quite a sight to see. Whoever the bad guys are, they left some very steamed and frightened motorists at the LaSalle and Lakeshore Drive intersection. One guy wanted their insurance information. He got a gun shoved in his face. It'll make all the newscast. The reporters talked to the eyewitnesses to try and get quotes on camera. They didn't know who you were then, but they will after it's been written up in the police reports. So where do we stand? I asked him. We're afraid to go back to our place. We can't stay away forever. Maybe Carpenter can afford to buy you some protection. We can't live with this kind of danger forever, I said. It must have something to do with Glenn Proctor's murder. We spent an hour going around on that one again. At the end, I said, look, the second time outside our building, obviously they were not afraid of recognition. The question is, why not? They were professionals who didn't have to worry. Wouldn't professionals only take a sure shot at a not-so-public place? Scott asked. The cops gave us blank looks. Quinn was nice enough to say, we don't know. Malowski said, we know something strange is going on. You explained all your logic. I think you know something and you aren't telling. Scott and I began protest, but Quinn raised his hand. Something is not right here, he said. You guys haven't committed a crime, so we aren't arresting you. The only way we can get information is from you, and you claim you don't know anything. We tried calling other airlines, but none of them has a record of Glenn Proctor flying on them any time in the past 2 weeks. We'll keep trying to track them down. We'll also go over the statements of everybody who saw anything outside your place. But if their descriptions are anything like yours, we won't have much. He was referring to our unhelpful eyewitness, a view of our pursuers. We hadn't had time to examine our attackers, so we hadn't been able to give very good descriptions. I felt foolish, scared, and angry. And you'll talk to all the neighbors, I said. And to the Proctors again? You heard me talk to Mr. Proctor. Quinn said, as far as he knows, Glenn is in Mexico. He probably didn't involve his family in whatever he was doing, I said. We don't know if there was something he was involved in, Quinn said. They left after promising to have the local police district give special attention to this street. This meant cop cars would drive down the street more often. Fat lot of good that would do. The cops left at 11. We decided to stay at the hotel. It was certainly an unlikely spot for us to be. Not a permanent solution, but it would be as safe as any place for the moment. I found that I was completely exhausted. I checked the sheets on the bed. They were grayish, but clean. Scott yawned and plopped down on the bed. I really screwed up, he said. If I hadn't invited Glenn Proctor in, none of this would have happened. The murder, the danger to us, trouble with the police, the fight we had. I'm really sorry, Tom. We've had fights before, I said. We've always gotten through them. I was pretty scared a bunch of times in the past few hours. I was glad you were with me. I don't know what I'd ever do without you. In minutes, we slipped under the covers. He lay, looking at me with his head propped up on his hand and elbow. With my fingertips, I caressed his hand. That lay on the puce-colored sheet. What I really want to know is where you learned to drive a horse and buggy that way. I'm a farm boy, he said. I grew up around horses. I did chores until I went to college. I knew that, I said. That still doesn't explain the Roman charioteer expertise. While Scott may have grown up on a farm and been super involved in athletics since he was 9, he had attended the University of Arizona on a baseball scholarship. He'd graduated cum laude with a degree in math. You never drove a carriage like that on the farm, I said. We had trucks, he admitted, but I figured I'd ridden horses often enough, and we used to play in an old buckboard out in the barn. Wasn't much really to grab the reins and go. I guess I didn't really think much about it. Scott reached up and flicked off the 2 lava lamps on the headboard. We moved closer together. I'm still scared, Scott's voice murmured against my shoulder. Me too, I said. I held him tight. Usually I can't fall asleep wrapped in his arms, but I was tired, and the warmth and closeness after our adventures felt better, better than usual. I fell asleep almost instantly. When I woke up, it was still light. It sounded as if a large chorus was singing ribald songs at the top of their lungs, right outside our door. Scott still slept. His ability to sleep through tremendous noise amazes me. I tried rolling over and going back to sleep, but the singing continued. Finally, I swung my legs out of bed. I picked up the phone to call the lobby. The noise stopped abruptly. I was too awake to fall back to sleep soon. I called Lester. We needed help. Money if we were going to hide out here. Maybe a change of clothes. I knew I could trust him. Lester said, I have an appointment set up for you with Jason Proctor, head of Proctor International, father of Glenn. How'd you manage that on a Sunday afternoon? I asked. I have an enormous number of contacts. I made a lot of money for many people as well as myself. I only had to call in one marker. It was simple. What's up? Scott asked. I told him about the meeting, then told Lester what had happened. He hooted loudly when I told him where we were. All he said was, both of you are going to need a change of clothes. I can get you clean linen and shirts, Lester said. They won't be perfect fits, but they'll do. He agreed to drop them off along with offering us his car. We didn't want to risk returning to our place after I hung up. Scott asked, do we dare go back to the penthouse? Not nice people might be watching, I said. Why don't they just arrest the people watching our apartment? Scott asked. It's not illegal to sit in a car or be on the street. If we could identify them, it would be different. You can't just yank people off the sidewalk because they look suspicious. I told him about Lester bringing us clothes and letting us use his car. We could rent a car, Scott said. We don't know what kind of connections these people have, I said. If they have access to credit card computers, they'll be able to pick up our trail. They can't have that kind of power. I don't want to take any chances. We can't walk to Lake Forest, Scott said. Hell, if it was Monday, I could just go to my bank, withdraw a bundle of cash, and go buy a new car. I think the banks are closed tomorrow, I said. It's Columbus Day weekend. I don't have school tomorrow either. Scott sighed. This is getting far too Byzantine, he said. I want to take as few risks as possible. Lester showed up a half hour later with clothes and a car. I love this place, he said. It brings back fond memories, which I have no intention of ever telling anyone about. In the lobby, Edna gave us a smile and a wave. Outside, the mist and drizzle of earlier had given way to heavy gray clouds and occasional tendrils of fog looking about the crumbling entrance to the hotel. October was giving its best indication that it was more than ready to ooze into a bleak and dank November. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.